Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to welcome you to the Baker Institute's Middle East Center's Conference on the Politics of Identity in the Middle East in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring. At the risk of predetermining the course of the deliberations, the fact that we have entitled the conference Divided Societies, Volatile States indicates that the outcomes have not been rosy. I would like to thank Dr. Shibli Telhami, our keynote speaker this morning, and all our distinguished panel participants who will be speaking throughout the day. We've assembled quite a good group. I would also like to recognize our two outstanding research fellows, Dr. Marwa Shalabi and Dr. Christian Ulrichsen, who have helped organize this event and who are leading the efforts to develop our Center for the Middle East here at the Baker Institute that we are expanding. The central theme of today's discussion, although timely, is not particularly new. Questions on the role of identity in the political landscape of the modern Middle East states began even before their borders were clearly defined. Contemporary pan-Arab or pan-Islamic ideology from the time of Sharif Hussein's revolt against the Ottoman Empire a century ago, to the Arab nationalist movement of Gamal Abdel Nasser, to the brutal vision of an ISIS caliphate today, all reflect the divergence in many parts of the region between imposed state identities and long-standing social, ethnic, and religious ones. Recent developments in the region, including the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the uprising of the Arab Spring, continue to highlight the importance of these questions. So looking across the Middle East, a competition and clashes between ethnic, sectarian, religious actors are inescapable and increasingly cross modern state boundaries. The catastrophe in Syria and Iraq, sectarian tension in the Arab Gulf countries, revolution and counter-revolution in Egypt and North Africa, the seemingly unsolvable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and failing state structures, very important, failing state structures throughout the region, all have important dimensions related to contested group identities. So our hope in organizing the event today is first to further our understanding of the past and present role of politics and identity in the many challenges facing this very troubled region. And second, to explore potential policies which can respond more effectively to the instability and division we currently see in the region. That is, of course, a high bar to set, but I am confident that our keynote speaker this morning will provide us with insights to lead our deliberations in the right direction. Dr. Shibli Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland at College Park and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is a prolific research author and commentator on current trends in the Middle East. Among his many projects, he is the principal investigator of the annual Arab Public Opinion Survey started back in 2003. He conducts extensive polling on both regional attitudes of the U.S. as well as American attitudes of the region, most recently on U.S. opinions of the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran and on the attitudes of American public toward ISIS in Syria. As a scholar of identity politics in the Arab world, Shibli has stated that, quote, no student of Middle Eastern politics can begin to understand the region without taking into account the forces of identity politics, unquote. His 2002 book, Identity and Foreign Policy in the Middle East, edited with Michael Barnett, provided country-based analyses on how multiple identities shape dynamics in the region. The text serves as a vital reminder for experts and policymakers to include national identity as a key object of study when looking at foreign policy in the Middle East. Too often in our foreign policy formulation, I can tell you this from my personal professional experience, we do not make this effort in Washington, and to the great cost of faulty policy initiatives. In addition to his academic qualifications, Dr. Telhami has served as an active advisor in U.S. policy discussion for over 2 decades. He was a member of the Anti-Incitement Committee as part of the Wye River Agreements, the Iraq Study Group, and a congressionally mandated advisory group on public diplomacy for the Arab and Muslim world, which I chaired at the request of Secretary of State Colin Powell in 2003. So please join me in welcoming Shibli Telhami to the program.
Thanks so much, Ed. I'm really grateful for this invitation, honored to be with you. I think I don't have to, let me just pick this up. I don't have to tell you about Ambassador Dirijan. I think everybody knows how highly respected all over the world he is, and certainly in Washington across partisan divide. It's been a pleasure to know him over the years, and I've learned a lot from you, Ed, throughout, so I'm grateful for this invitation. What I'd like to do is, I mean, obviously this is, I'm here to learn as much as to tell you about my research, because there are a lot of really interesting people participating in this conference I'd like to learn from. And what I'd like to do is just tell you something about my approach to the question of identity, how it drove my interest in the analysis that I have pursued over the past 2 decades, and just give you my thoughts. First, in terms of certain hypotheses about identity selection in the Arab world, and second, about some empirical findings about what we find is happening in the Arab world. First, you know, we all know this question of identity, particularly political identity. Identity doesn't need to be political, but certainly collective political identity in the region has been debated for a long time, and we all know that, you know, part of the scholarship on the Middle East has always focused on this misfit between, you know, local identities and boundaries and transnational identities and state identities. It's always been a struggle, really, from the inception of the Middle East political system after the end of World War I. And so that debate has never stopped in some ways, but it has become more central, certainly to my thinking, in the 1990s. And one reason, when I started being interested in doing an empirical study of what's taken place in the Middle East in terms of identity transformation, what drove my thinking was the information revolution. It was really the Al Jazeera phenomenon in the mid-1990s. And as I was observing across the Arab world to see this, you know, kind of shared information base that people had across the region that transcended the national media that had been really the dominant media across the Arab world, that I hypothesized that over time, there was going to be an impact of this transnational media, particularly satellite TV, on the way people define themselves. It was bound to have an impact. And so for me, the study of public opinion was never about what people think, but as a window into how they define themselves. And so for me, public opinion, at least the way I do public opinion, or when I'm conducting public opinion polling, I'm asking questions not in order to find the discrete value of that opinion at any given time, but to frame the question as a way of understanding the prism through which people render an opinion. And that prism, which is what I call the identity prism, is what we're really all after, because we know that identity precedes opinion. Including here in the US, I've been doing a lot of polling in the US, and we're finding that there are, you know, what you might call ideological communities, or faith communities, or identity communities. You could predict their opinions because of that. So opinions are really, in a way, are an avenue to understanding, to ascertaining how people define themselves. The question is, how has that been changing? And we know that it has been changing, partly as a function of this information revolution, partly as a function of other things. So the second point I want to make, in terms by way of introduction, is that we all understand that that identity in general is contextual. And so when I'm trying to understand, you know, how people define themselves, I'm trying to understand it in a given context. What does that mean? There've been experiments done. If a Moroccan asks an Egyptian, what are you, or who are you, the Egyptian will give one answer to the Moroccan. If an American asks an Egyptian, who are you, they will give another answer. we all know that identity is defined in relation to another. So we always have to keep that in mind in the context of what is the context in which you're asking the question about identity, in order to understand what kind of answer people give and try to interpret that answer in particular. Third, I think that we all have multiple identities. I think that one of the silly things that we sometimes do when we do polling is we think the world is divided between people who think this and people who think that, when in fact we're all divided. And so the best avenue to understand the change is not to understand how communities change over time, but how people change over time. That is, we all have, you know, an Egyptian is at once an Egyptian and an Arab, a Muslim or a Christian, and there are all these things. It's not just one thing. And the question, of course, is which ones do they favor at any given time? That changes over time. Where they place the emphasis over time changes, does not remain constant. So in some ways, what I sought out to do in this project was to try to understand how identity changes over time, how people emphasize one aspect of the identity over the others. And what I would like to do is share with you some of the findings and then give you several hypotheses about interpreting how I think people select identity, and then carry it over into the sectarianism. I know there's going to be a lot of discussion of sectarianism here, into you know, what explains what we call sectarianism in the current context, how people define themselves in terms of sects. First, before I get into the findings, I want to say that when I started the original project, was actually late 1990s, and then systematically started doing it really right after 9/11 for a decade that preceded the Arab uprisings. So really all the way to 2010, and then I had a couple of years after the Arab uprising to see how that is shifting. And I asked multiple questions about identity, and you'll see it's not just the straightforward question. So one question I ask, I know you're all these things, Arab, Muslim, Christian, citizen of the world, Egyptian, Jordanian, Saudi, but which one is more important to you today? And then I'll ask which one is the second most important to you today, to just reinforce the selection to try to figure out whether there's a pattern, and to see how that is changing and how it's changing and correlating it with various indicators, including the media viewership across the region. So that's one set of questions. Another set of questions has to do more with how identity influences what they do. Does it matter behaviorally? Do they want, regardless of how people define themselves, whether they define themselves as Arab, Egyptian, or Muslim or Christian, do they think the role of the state is to serve the interest of the identity as they define it, that is the interest of Muslims, Arabs, or Egyptians, for example? And a third set of questions has to do with indirect indicators about identity, by asking them the view of big issues like who are your heroes in the world, you know, who's the leader in the world that you respect the most. And so we have all sorts of indicators to try to figure out how people identify themselves. So what I want to do here is I'm going to share some of these findings with you and then give you an interpretation. The first set of findings has to do with, if you look at this data that's there, is from 2004 to 2011. And it is, this is specifically with regard to only 4 identities. One is country identity, one Arab, Muslim, or Christian, citizen of the world, and not sure. And you could see that the last one on this data set here is the end of 2011. It's November 2011. So really right after the overthrow of Mubarak and certainly Ben Ali in Tunisia. Actually, before, I should say right after, yeah, the Egyptian revolution and the Tunisian revolution right there. So what you see, first of all, aggregately, is that with the exception of 1 year, which is immediately after the Iraq War, you had a spike in the blue, which is people said across the 6 countries that I study, that country is number 1. But otherwise, you can see that Muslim, all the way to 2010, was on the rise. Islamic identity was number 1, trumped country and trumped Arab. And you can see that Arab remained relatively robust, and that country in general, with the exception of that spike after the Iraq War, declined. And that's aggregately in 6 countries. The 6 countries that I did were Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates. I'm going to break it down by country, and you'll see that there are variations, but I want you to see that the trends were roughly the same. You can see that there was change right after the Arab uprisings. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on because I'll give you an interpretation. For now, I just want to go through the next slide, which is by country. If you look at Saudi Arabia, this is people who say their first identity is either country Arab or Muslim. And you can see again, all the way to 2009, well, actually throughout, you can see that Muslim is number 1 in Saudi Arabia. And you can see that Arab actually increased in Saudi Arabia over time. And you can see that state actually declined a little bit, but always was lower than Muslim. Look at that. In fact, interestingly, in Saudi Arabia, the identification with the state is the lowest of any Arab country that we study. And I'm going to come back to that, sort of what explains these kind of identifications. And when you also combine those people who say what their first identity and second identity is together, you still find strength. You find the country is even weaker, actually. So it's really by far in 3rd place, if you wish, in that. If you look at Egypt, you can see how state was so strong in Egypt, and was, by the way, before 2004 as well. We had data also before 2004 in Egypt that we're not having here, that it was by far number 1. And look at what happened, particularly after 2006 with the state. And again, the rise of Islamic identity, particularly after the Iraq War, and all the way through the Gaza War, and then leveling off a little bit, but by 2010, 2011, you have Islamic identity increasing in Egypt, and that's even more so when you look at first and second identity together, where you see Muslim identity certainly rising and country identity declining from that early period. When you look at Lebanon, it's a fascinating story, because I'm going to come back to Lebanon, because Lebanon, you're talking about a country that we equate with sectarianism. I mean, generally, now, of course, there's a lot more sectarianism in other places. So when you look at Lebanon and you would look at sectarianism, I'm going to show you sect by sect in a few minutes, but look at how interesting it is. Think about what we saw in Saudi Arabia, where in Saudi Arabia, identity with the state was so weak. And look at Lebanon, the most sectarian of Arab countries, at least historically. Certainly now we have even more sectarian countries. But you can see how robust that finding has been over time, and how Muslim was actually in 3rd place. And you'll see that actually to be true even among Muslim communities, where Arab had been number 2. And when you look at it, combining 1 and 2 together, you can see that Muslim is actually in 3rd place overall. So before I get into the sectarian part, I want to give you one interpretation of these findings, particularly the decline of the state aggregately, the rise of Islamic identity over the decade, and what we have been seeing since. And then I'm going to give you some more reflections on the sectarian part of the equation. My hypothesis about identity selection is that, in a way, you could think of yourself as someone who has multiple selves. and that we select one over the others based on two rules that I've formalized, actually. Two rules on different ends of the spectrum. On one end, you jump on the bandwagon of that aspect of the self that is most promising for your aspirations, and dump that aspect of the self that is not promising. And on the other end of the spectrum, you are what you have to defend. That is, that aspect of the self that is under assault, you rally behind. And that the dynamism between those two rules really tells you about how we ultimately select a self, which one we embrace over the others. That this is dynamic relationship between those two general rules about what we dump and what we select over time. And I'm going to give you an interpretation, particularly with regard to the rise of Islamic identity over the decade and the decline of the state. I think with regard to the decline of the state, it's not particularly difficult to figure out why it has declined, particularly at a decade when the state wasn't, when the focus was principally on foreign policy. The state had not been doing well in domestic politics throughout. That has been a puzzle for scholars of the Middle East, why they have maintained power despite the fact that they were not seen to be serving the interests of the constituents. But it was a decade, and you recall that whole decade, if you look at 2000 to 2010, if you look at that, the decade that preceded the Arab uprisings. I know there are a lot of people who will hypothesize about the Arab uprisings being, driven by economics and politics and domestic differences and everything else. Of course, all of which is true in a sense, because we know that these things were driving forces. But there was nothing in that decade that told you that the economy was worse than previous decade, that the places where it looked like it was about economic struggle or even direct political struggle per se. In fact, that, for whatever reason, that decade of 2000 to 2010 was characterized by foreign policy issues that people thought to be existential, that in a way highlighted the fact that people were angry with their rulers over other things. Because if you look at, if you want to call that decade the decade of Al Jazeera, the decade of the new media, because that's what it was the decade of the information revolution. By the way, by the time the Arab uprisings took place, in a polling that we do on the media, when we ask what is your main source of information for news, we had roughly 50% aggregately in the 6 countries say Al Jazeera, 50%. And in all of these countries, majorities of people said that information that is the source of information for news came from a television station from outside their own state. And so that tells you something about how powerful that medium was during that decade. And if you review that decade and see what was the focal point of that decade, what propelled Al Jazeera to become the biggest media outlet in the Middle East, it wasn't covering food riots. Go look back at look at what was the debate dominated by. Started with the Palestinian Intifada in 2000, covering the bloodshed day in and day out, followed by 9/11 and the war on terrorism and what that did to the relationship with the Muslim world, followed by the debate about the Iraq War, then the Iraq War, then what's happening in the Iraq War, then the consequences of the Iraq War, then the 2006 Lebanon War, then the 2008 Gaza War. That was the decade. The decade was, over the whole period, the most compelling issues that mobilized people and that were used by the media were foreign policy issues, not domestic issues. And you can see that. And that's important because when you're asking people identity, you have to understand the context. So if you're a Moroccan asking an Egyptian, who are you? They may say, I'm an Egyptian, or might say, I'm a Muslim, or they might say, but the answer is specific. When you ask them broadly in a decade that was like the one we watched, they are juxtaposing that vis-a-vis the US. and the West. And what we found throughout the whole decade is that when we ask people, what do you think explains American policy in the Middle East or the war on terrorism, the overwhelming majority, nearly 80, 90% would say it's trying to weaken the Muslim world, just as you would have almost equivalent to those who help Israel. Those are the two top issues. And so my hypothesis is that part of the rise in Islamic identity that we see in the polling isn't necessarily a function of the rise of Islamist group per se, even though I don't want to diminish, I'll come back to that in a minute. As much as it is for a lot of people, it's an assertion of reaction to Islam under assault and a sense that Islam under assault, and saying, I don't want to have to apologize for the fact that I'm a Muslim. I don't have to apologize for the fact that Sharia happens to be the law of Islam. And so in some ways, there's that kind of reaction. With my students, I ask the question, when I talk about it, I start with the question, why is Barack Obama black? And they're kind of always surprised by the question, what do you mean, why is Barack Obama black? I said, why isn't he white? Why is he black? I mean, he's at least 50% white, but actually he lived more in the white family and grew up and went to white schools, and he lives in a white country. And so why does he define himself to be black, and why do we define him as being black? I mean, that's not something that we should take for granted. I mean, when you look at it, we take it for granted, but it can't be taken for granted. And I submit to you that part of the reason for it is you are what you have to defend. And I think that is one thread that runs through this particular kind of response. The second is pertaining to the decline of the state. I mean, I think we all knew that states were not popular. That was not a surprise to Middle East scholars. I think it aggravated by the fact that they were seen to be either inept or at least collaborating on foreign policies that went against their interests. And so the fact that and you can see, in fact, the decline of the state takes particular decline after the Iraq War and go back to the first, after the Iraq War and the 2006 Lebanon War, it takes a big hit. And interestingly, when you look at the immediately 2004, when you look at the Iraq War, it had actually double-edged sword for the region, because what I think happened right after, immediately after the war, when the coverage in the media was all about the anarchy and the disintegration of society and the insecurity and all of the things that were happening in Iraq, that rulers in the Arab world said, would you rather have Cairo or would you rather have Baghdad? Would you rather have Riyadh or would you rather have Baghdad? That there was a certain rallying around the state as a way of reacting to this. And I would even submit to you, to go back to Lebanon, that one reason why Lebanese identity is strong, robust throughout the whole period, is that the Lebanese essentially feel a threat to Lebanon because of the sectarianism. And they rally behind, they want to take refuge in their asserting the Lebanese identity because they don't want it to disintegrate. And by the way, here's the other interesting thing. I don't do polling in Iraq, but there were polls in Iraq on Iraqi identity that found also majorities of Sunnis and Shia identify themselves as Iraqi first, identifying myself more with the state than the rest. And I think it is because they feel it's under assault, they don't have an alternative, they want to rally behind it. People want to transcend the sects. They're terrified by sectarianism, they don't embrace it. And this is a suggestion I want to make when I come back to at the end. Let me give you one more example with regard to sects. We have a scholar of Palestinians in Israel here, Asad Ghanim, and I did, we could see I've done over time, I did identification, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who constitute 20% of the population in Israel. They're broken down roughly Muslim, Christian, Druze, the three different sects. And when you ask them, what are you first? Arab, Muslim, Christian, Druze, Israeli citizen of the world. It's interesting to see. I mean, you can look at the numbers there, where the Palestinian, the blue is Palestinian, and then the orange is Arab, and you can see that Christian. Pardon me. Well, it depends on how that's showing on this on my screen. The colors are always the second one is an Israeli, right? Yeah, and the Arab on this one is the gray. So, well, it shows as a gray here. The green is Druze, I think. Yes, the green is Druze, because that's the Druze community. It's the only one that has actually some very strong ethnic, religious identification. But you can see in some ways that the Muslims and Christians first define themselves as a Palestinian or Arab. With the Muslims, they also identify them as Muslims. Very few define themselves as Israelis. And with the Druze, a different story, and it tells you something about which community feels part of itself under assault. I want to just go back. I want to go back to this one. I want to conclude with two thoughts. One thought is that people define themselves or people cannot define themselves in their relationship with us independently from what we do to them. It's an interactive relationship, and people change. And I want to tell you something here that's an interesting story, and somewhat an optimistic story. When you look at the change from 2010 to 2011, we're all looking at the Arab, Muslim, and country, but look all the way down at a line that says citizen of the world. And that's a line that had in the past gotten very, very few, always below 10%, saying first citizen of the world, what I call cosmopolitan, that they see themselves as citizen of the world over being an Arab or Muslim or Egyptian or Saudi. And that what happened after the Arab uprisings, what you see is that you see a remarkable increase in 1 year across just a remarkable increase in 1 year from 2010 to 2011, where people are almost more than double the number of people who say, I'm citizen of the world first. It's really quite an interesting story. And I want to tell you that if you look back at that period, what you find wasn't just the optimism of, as you might expect, a lot of young people are in that. This is somewhat dependent on age. But what this reflects was a certain degree of optimism that came out with this social media and the world reaction to Tahrir Square and what people hoped it would entail. And the fascinating story is that so you have decline of these other identities, an increase in citizen of the world identity, and corresponding to that, we did a poll here in the United States about how Americans see Arabs and Muslims right after, in 2011, right after the Arab uprisings, to see whether their view of the Arabs have changed or improved or went down. And we found that actually American views of Arabs had significantly improved because of the Arab uprisings. and that a majority of Americans had an optimistic view of the Middle East and a certain sense of affinity, and a majority of Americans had a positive view of the Middle East during that period. That has since declined because of the changes that have taken place. But what I'm saying is that it's a dynamic relationship. It is, about their relationship with the rest of the world that they make these decisions. I also want to say that still these decisions matter. Why? Because when we ask people who identify themselves as Arab first or Muslim first, a transnational identity over the state, and we ask them, do you believe that it is the role of the government to serve its citizens or to serve the interest of Arabs and Muslims more broadly? What we find is that a majority say the interest of Arabs and Muslims more broadly. And that's really an interesting thing up to 2011. This has changed since then, again, because of the things that we see on the ground. But it is consequential for the way they think about the role of government. It's not just an assertion of identity. It has practical consequences for their expectations of what their government should do. One final point about sectarianism. What I'm suggesting is that sectarianism isn't a natural political divide. I know this seems to be very odd to make that hypothesis because, in fact, when you look at what we see in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, there's no escaping that there's deep sectarianism. And I call it sectarianism because that's what it is. I mean, nobody could avoid the fact that particularly there's a deep Sunni-Shia divide that has emerged. And we see it in the way people relate to each other, in the way communities are organized, in the way politics are playing itself out. And I don't think you can even understand it in the short term without reference to that. So I'm not suggesting there isn't. But here's the thing I want to leave with you. Now, Sunnis and Shias have been around since the beginning of Islam. It's not like suddenly we have Sunnis and Shia. I mean, we've always had Sunnis and Shia. They've always had their differences. Sometimes theological differences, sometimes cultural differences, sometimes, all kinds of differences. And they've lived together. So the real question is not, is there sectarianism? Of course there's sectarianism. The question is, when does sectarianism trump other identities? That's the question. So, if you're a Shia Iraqi, of course you're a Shia Iraqi. You're a Shia. You're proud of being Shia. You should be. Why shouldn't you be? If you're Sunni, you're proud of being a Sunni. Why shouldn't you be? But you're also an Iraqi, and you're also an Arab, and you're also a citizen of the world, and you're also a professor or a lawyer or a man or a woman or a father, and all these things. So why does that sectarian identity rise to the top to trump all? That's the interesting question. And it's not a constant in history. This is something that changes over time. And so the question you have to ask, when does that rise to the top and trump everything else? And you cannot understand that without understanding the alternatives. What is under assault and what are the alternatives? If you are an Iraqi and Iraqi state collapses and no one is there to present security or food or anything else, what does it mean to be Iraqi other than theoretically? You wish for the Iraqi state, you embrace it, you assert it. But in practice, how could you rely on it? When the Arabs are divided and there is no one who can claim to be a leader and there's no prospect of Arabism, how could you embrace Arabism? Where does that come from? How are you going to do it? In fact, by the way, in the origin of Arab nationalism early in the 20th century, a lot of the groups that went to pan-Arabism, that took refuge in Arab nationalism, were minorities, like Christians and Druze and Alawites, but also Sunnis, who didn't want to be trapped in the religious division or sectarian division. They took refuge in nationalism because it's much more comprehensive and it overlooked all these sects. But it didn't take hold at the popular level until it seemed like it could be delivered. When Nasser of Egypt, of the greatest Arab country, took the leadership, and then they could embrace it because it becomes a viable option in their mind. But before it was viable, it couldn't be embraced except intellectually. So the reality of it is it's all about creating alternatives. It's not about sectarian being the cause of conflict. It is sectarianism becoming a problem because of the demise of the options. And there is no way you can think of the rise of sectarianism, I think, in its modern manifestation without understanding the horrific consequences of the Iraqi war and the collapse of the Iraqi state. Because that, more than the sectarianism itself, explains that conflict. And we are dealing ultimately with practical alternative, with promises, and we are dealing with that aspect of the self that is usually under assault. Thank you very much.
Yes. We have time for questions.